This podcast is sponsored by the Trader Funding Program by Forex Analytics. Do you want to trade somebody else's money but want to receive the lion's shares of the profit and take none of the risk? Pass an assessment with a one-time fee and trade your own live trading account. There's no time limit to pass. Various account sizes are available based on your needs, and each comes with the Forex Analytics platform and access to one of the most active trading communities in the markets for a period of time. Visit traderfundingprogram.com for more information.
And welcome to the MicDropMarkets podcast. I'm Tracy Shuchart with my co-host, Ralph Schoellhammer. Today's guest is Ernest Scheyder, journalist and author, here to discuss his new book, The War Below: Lithium, Copper, and the Global Battle to Power Our Lives. Ernest is a senior correspondent for Reuters covering green energy transition and minerals that undergird. He previously covered the U.S. shale revolution, politics, and I was around for that, politics and the environment, and has held roles with the Associated Press and Bangor Daily News. A native of Maine, Scheyder is a graduate of the University of Maine and Columbia Journalism School. His website is ernestscheyder.com, and you can follow him on Twitter at Ernest Scheyder, and I'll put all this information in the show notes below. And with that, welcome, Ernest. I've been following you on Twitter for a very long time, so it's very exciting to get to talk to you for the very first time. So just as an introductory, if you want to give us a little bit more on your background and what kind of made the switch from oil to transition minerals, and what inspired you really to write this book?
Sure. Well, great to be with you, Tracy, and great to finally connect, as you say, after following and retweeting each other for more than a decade. And Ralph, great to be with you as well. I've been at Reuters almost 15 years, and I spent the first chunk of that time covering the oil and gas industry. And I started at Reuters in the office headquarters in Times Square in New York. And as the US shale boom took off, I grew more and more interested in the technology and the people that were powering the oil and natural gas revolution here in the United States. So I spent a lot of time in Western Pennsylvania and Ohio, writing about different fracking technologies and different shale formations there that were being developed. And then in 2014, Reuters asked me to move to North Dakota, where I spent about 2 years writing about the Bakken, one of the biggest shale formations in the world, and the people and the money that were undergirding this giant economic revival there. Minor aside I'd love to share is that my rent in Williston, North Dakota was more than double what I was paying in New York City, which just gives you a little bit of the color of the supply and demand imbalance there during that boom time. And then I moved to Houston in 2016 to write about big oil and OPEC, Exxon, Chevron, Occidental, and this large cartel that has controlled so much of the world's oil. But I became really curious about the energy transition around 2018 and jumped into the chance to write about lithium and copper and cobalt and other minerals that power many energy transition devices. It was a relatively small space at that time compared certainly to today. And I became intrigued about the potential for where we're going to get these building blocks if indeed we think climate change is serious. And also if we increasingly want more electronic devices that are built with all these critical minerals and metals. And so that's where I've been the past 4 or 5 years, professionally speaking. And the more that I wrote about this space in my day job at Reuters, the more I saw a cohesive narrative emerge here around tension points about where, how, and why our world hopes to get these building blocks. And I did see some parallels with my oil and gas time, but there you had some people that perhaps were in one camp or the other, like, yes, I firmly support oil and gas, or no, I just think it's bad, period. But with critical minerals, it was more nuanced. You had a lot of folks say that, yes, we do believe that the world needs to produce more of these critical minerals, especially lithium and copper. but we just don't want it near us for various reasons, whether that's because of indigenous rights reasons or because of ecological or biodiversity concerns or other reasons. And the more I noticed there's opposition to certain projects across the United States and the world, really, the more I started to question where we're going to get these building blocks. And so that is sort of the narrative that forms the backbone of The War Below. It's a book about choice and a book about the choices we face if we want this transition. So that's the broad basis of the book, and excited to talk about it with both of you today.
Yeah, maybe Tracy, if it's okay, I would start, because there was one thought when I was reading your book over the last 7 days, and I have to admit that it's a page turner. So to the listeners who might not be in the commodity space and the rare earth mineral space, it's definitely worthwhile reading. It's such a beautiful way to look into what makes the modern world run, or on what the modern world runs. So it's really highly recommended, and particularly on this aspect. It reminded me a little bit of H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, right? Where you have, they have the Eloi on top who live this beautiful lives, this comfortable lives, and then you have the Morlocks underground who do all the work, who make everything run. I mean, that they also eat the Elois from time to time. That's a separate part of the story, but I think it might be a little bit of an apt comparison, because you kind of tell in your book some really nice stories about potential mining in the United States. And it's not as if kind of approval of the transition immediately translates into approval for mining projects. And so we kind of try to shift, quote unquote, the Morlock work to, for example, the Democratic Republic of Congo and to other parts of the world, because we like the transition, but we don't like the potential underlying necessities. But you also mention, I think you talk about the oldest copper mine in the United States, so one of the oldest mines in the United States that you visited, that shows it is possible to do conscious mining. So as we move forward, as we're going to need more of these resources, what do you think the journey, particularly in the United States, but also globally, will most likely go if you kind of, take out your crystal ball and speculate a little bit with us?
Yeah, Ralph, what I really wanted to do with the book is to bring the complexities of these supply chains that you just mentioned to the reader, because I think, especially in the United States, the citizenry and consumers have been just sort of oblivious for too long about where the building blocks come from that power our everyday lives. And so I really want folks to think through, okay, where do we hope to get cobalt from, or copper, or nickel, or lithium, or any of these other critical minerals? Because if we don't have these discussions, then we have to be comfortable with them coming from places that might not share what are probably widely considered standard ESG practices in the modern West. A stark example that I explore in the book is the idea of cobalt production in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And unfortunately, there can be a strong group of artisanal miners, basically amateur miners, that do produce some of the cobalt that's produced there. And the DRC has some of the world's largest supplies of this vital metal. Sometimes you can have children as young as 6 or 7 that are actually producing cobalt, and they sell the rock to a middleman, and then it can just get filtered through the global supply chain. So it can be nearly impossible to figure out where that cobalt came from, and if it came from the DRC, and under what situations it was produced. And that's just one critical metal. We don't actually produce that much cobalt right now here in the United States. In fact, a cobalt mine in Idaho that was under development was mothballed last year, due in part to low prices for the metal on the global market. And so it didn't have support from Washington or from the broader ESG movement. And so these are some of the questions that I'm bringing to the reader here. I'm saying, okay, what are the choices that we're willing to make? We're not making the choices right now. And The War Below specifically focuses on many projects in the United States on purpose, because we don't have a history in the past 20 or 30, 40 years of mining here in this country. We might start to see some of that grow as we have more of this energy transition accelerate. But the book really looks into, okay, well, if we want these things, if we think climate change is real, if we want cell phones and other devices that are increasingly powered by lithium-ion batteries, we've got to be having a discussion about where we want this. And those do affect people. And so this is also a story about the people that are affected by the choices and our lack of choices.
So when we're talking about this particular industry, how do you resolve the fact, do we do this in a third world country where they do, as you mentioned, have miners mining for this? But yet, if we do this in North America, for example, obviously it's going to be much more expensive. So, how do you kind of resolve this, or does it get resolved at all?
Yeah. Tracy, the analog that I like to draw is to the textile industry. I think increasingly you're starting to see corporations in the textile industry respond to consumer concerns about sweatshops, for instance. Nobody wants to buy a shirt or other article of clothing that was produced by somebody in atrocious conditions in a different part of the world. And so you're starting to see some consumers willing to pay more for ethically sourced clothing. And I think increasingly we're going to start to see a two-tiered pricing schema for metals and minerals, knowing full well that the metals that you buy, you might be paying a little bit more, but you know that they're produced with certain ESG standards. And you're starting to see this being pushed by some mining companies, especially junior mining companies that are looking for fresh capital across the investment space. And so I think you're going to start to see that more and more. Certainly price has dictated a lot of the supply chain throughout history, that, price is usually one of the main determining factors. But I think if the coronavirus pandemic taught us anything, it's that we need to pay more attention to where the things come from that underpin our everyday lives. It was 4 years ago this month that we saw the initial waves of the coronavirus pandemic and then realized that North America doesn't make any masks. That sort of most basic of consumer medical equipment, right? Piece of consumer medical equipment. And I think that really underscored for a lot of folks in the West just how important what this sleepy concept of a supply chain really, really is. And so you just magnify that now across the entire electrification supply chain. I mean, just take lithium, for instance. One of the main producing regions in the world for lithium is northern Chile in the Atacama Desert. And so let's just follow this on the route. So you take the lithium out of the ground via large evaporation ponds. You've got some processing on site. You might truck it to the Chilean coast and then ship it across the Pacific Ocean to a processor, probably in China or elsewhere in Asia, where it's then converted into a type of lithium that can be put into a cathode, which is part of a battery. And then it might be put into a battery pack and then maybe put into a piece of consumer electronic before being shipped back across the Pacific Ocean to the United States before then being sold in a store somewhere. That's an extremely long supply chain. Just think of the carbon emissions from shipping alone. And if we're going to get serious about climate change and carbon emissions, and if we're going to want to have more secure supply chains, doesn't it make more sense to think about, are there some places in North America where that lithium could be produced? And I don't think we're having those discussions right now. So I really hope to bring to the reader with The War Below this idea of choice, as I was saying.
And don't you think, sorry, just one more question.
Go ahead, yeah.
And don't you think this has to do with processing? I mean, I think it's utterly frightening that we have almost 90% of metal processing for these critical minerals are all done in China. And so not only is mining an issue, but it's also processing these critical minerals as well.
Sure, of course. And that's the mining, putting a shovel in the ground is certainly one part, but then you've got to mold that rock into a usable form to go into a battery or another device. And you're right, Tracy. China has cornered that market there as well. I mean, for lithium, there's very few facilities in the United States right now to process lithium into the two main usable forms that battery manufacturers like. It's known as carbonate or hydroxide. China has cornered that market, and there's some American companies that even have set up shop there to process. And it is a huge economic powerhouse. I mean, China not only controls the processing, but it'll tell downstream manufacturers like, okay, hey, you get a discount if you use metals that are processed inside our borders. That is, you're not paying a VAT because when it's exported. So that further financially incentivizes their own manufacturing industry. And so you're starting to see efforts in the United States to perhaps replicate that. The IRA certainly tries to move that forward. And there's been some money doled out as part of the BIL and other programs coming out of Washington, D.C. But midstream, that sort of the refining aspect is a huge sort of glaring hole right now in this supply chain as well. Because you're right, once you get out of the ground, you got to do something with it. Otherwise, it's just rock sitting there.
If I may play devil's advocate for a second. Let's assume, which would be my greatest dream of all, let's assume I'm the CEO of a huge mining company.
Okay.
And I have the option to say, okay, shall we start new mines? And we would probably assume that starting a new mine, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe I'm too pessimistic. Let's say it takes 10 to 12 to 15 years to start a new mine, the entire permitting process until we actually get stuff out of the ground. And if we argue that what underlies the additional demand for the resources, for the minerals, is the energy transition, what if I say, what if in 10 years, in 12 years, in 15 years, nobody believes in the energy transition anymore? Because if I'm a miner, right, I think I would have to think long term. And the promise that was originally made, at least in Europe, we see this, I think, unfolding now, that the energy transition will make energy more reliable and cheaper. That's obviously not happening. Now, the climate, that's a separate issue, but even their voters are now starting to hesitate because all of a sudden, everybody says climate change is very important if the money to solve it doesn't come out of my pocket. So there's a certain shift going on. We see it politically, we see it in public interactions. So wouldn't it be for me more beneficial to just either buy up smaller mining companies to consolidate the market, or B, kind of quote unquote go short on my own product? Because as everybody predicts, for example, this need for copper. Everybody predicts this need for nickel, for cobalt. But of course, that is based on the assumption that the transition is actually happening. What is now, if everybody goes all in, we really start to ramp up mining. You also write very intriguingly in your book about the idea, I think, to get lithium directly from seawater. So that's really, we invest money in this. We really know huge capital expenditures. And then in 12 years, you have government say, you know what, actually, gas power is fine, nuclear is great, all these other areas that would need the critical minerals, we might do it as a niche thing, but that's not going to really be the core anymore. Because again, I'm just playing devil's advocate here.
Sure.
That is what I would be worried about as a mining operator, is that all these politicians who for 20 years talked about the energy transition, in 12 years will say, energy transition? I never heard about this. I never said anything about it. Right? I think the Canadian minister just was adamantly, it was not Trudeau, it was, I think, his energy minister, his environmental minister, who was adamantly against nuclear, and now all of a sudden he's a proponent of nuclear and doesn't remember anything he said 10 years ago. Couldn't the same thing happen with the energy transition as well?
Certainly. I mean, it's to play devil's advocate, right? I suppose anything could happen. I mean, what I wanted to unpack with the book, though, is where the current demand projections are right now, even beyond climate change scenarios. So I would sort of put minerals demand in two buckets, and I do in the book: how we fight climate change, and then also just the sheer demand for electronics. And initially, when I was writing the book or ideating the book, I wanted to look at it through the lens of electric vehicles. And for many, many reasons, I decided not to focus specifically on that end market and to broaden it out here to those two buckets I just described. And it was really important for me because I think regardless of where the political will goes for the energy transition, there's going to still be a huge jump in the demand from the electronic sector broadly. I have a chapter in the book that looks at leaf blowers, which sort of sounds silly and innocuous, but I got a house a few years ago, and I decided to engage in that most suburban of tasks, mowing my lawn. And so I got an electric lawnmower and an electric weed whacker, and yes, and an electric leaf blower, just as I was writing this book. And it took me down this rabbit hole of saying, okay, well, where did the cobalt come from in this battery that powers this leaf blower? What about the copper or the lithium or the nickel? And I got to tell you, Ralph, I got a lot of resources at my disposal here at Reuters and a lot of great contacts throughout the mining and minerals world. I couldn't figure out where any of those metals came from at all. I had no clue if the cobalt came from the DRC. I did not know if the copper came from Peru. I didn't know if the lithium came from Chile. I didn't know any of this stuff. I didn't know where it was processed. And that's just for one device. It's an electronic device that has nothing to do with the energy transition. It just so happens that this is one of the common household appliances that is increasingly powered by a lithium-ion battery. And now you extrapolate that across the many, 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 many millions of other devices out there across the globe that are powered by this sort of humble lithium-ion battery. Certainly your cell phone, your laptop, many, many other devices we use every single day. And so I really wanted to bring to the reader here with The War Below this idea that, yes, I mean, the energy transition obviously is extremely important and climate change has got to be addressed. But political will does change depending on many, many factors. But regardless, the sheer demand for these building blocks is just going to continue to grow. I mean, copper, for instance, is not just used in solar panels and wind turbines. It's also used in wiring of every type that's out there right now. It's used in piping. It's used in so many other things. So you can think about the manufacturing sector as it continues to grow. You can think about space exploration that will need a lot more minerals and metals before we start mining asteroids, which is, perhaps a book down the line before we'll get there. And so when we think about all of these electronics that are out there, I mean, for me, I mean, even the cameras we're using to talk to each other right now that were not commonplace even 5 years ago. So we're just starting to see this proliferation of so many of these other building blocks out there. So for me, it's so much more than the energy transition.
That absolutely makes sense. And your book covers a variety of topics, from dangers of mining to the economic and political forces that kind of shape that industry. And so how do you balance these different aspects when you have, you know, when you have one side saying, you know, we need this to happen, and the other side, but it's dirty, but it's still dirty. You know what I'm saying? So how do you put, and you explain this beautifully in your storytelling. So, but for people that haven't read your book yet, go about how you went about resolving this.
Yeah, there's many of the stories in the book are sort of very sticky and intractable, and I focused on them on purpose because I wanted the reader, for her or himself, to say, okay, what would I do if I were a policymaker or a politician here, or I had to decide? A great example of the tension around this is the proposed twin metals, copper and nickel and cobalt project in northern Minnesota. And I explore this in depth in one of the chapters in the book. This is a project that is an underground deposit. It would be an underground mine if developed, and it would have a huge supply of copper and nickel, and yes, cobalt, like we were talking about earlier, that is primarily produced right now in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. But the problem is that the type of rock that contains these metals, when exposed to water, can form acid. And what's also in northern Minnesota? The border with the Great Lakes. And you can think of the Great Lakes as sort of the beating heart of the North American waterway infrastructure. And so you can imagine if you had acid seepage into the Great Lakes, like that would obviously not be good. Now I should say here that the company that wants to produce the metals there has said it feels like it can do this safely without any damage at all. But a lot of conservationists, including many in northern Minnesota that rely on a lot of ecotourism for their daily incomes, have been saying, and strongly for years, that they do not support this mine at all. And so it's created this huge multi-decade battle that I chronicle in the book. And it brings to the reader, okay, well, this sort of sticky reality. Okay, what matters more here? You know, and I'm not saying that if this mine doesn't get developed, we're going to have children in the Congo most definitely power the supply chain. I don't think it's necessarily that black and white. But what I will say is that these are issues that we have to be thinking through. We can't just put our heads in the sand anymore. And there are people on both sides, on all sides here, that are very earnest with their beliefs that the mine should be developed or not be developed. And what's resulted is it's a political hot potato in Washington right now. And so depending on who's in the White House, that has resulted in various approaches to this project. But I think that we're going to have to really have a collective grappling, especially here in the United States, about what are the choices we're willing to make. And if we're not willing to produce this mine or related mines, you know, are we willing to get the metals from elsewhere? And at what standards? What exactly is good mining? And so I do go into a little bit more of the chapters in the book about how various parties are trying to establish the idea of good mining, including exploring how Tiffany and Company, the iconic jeweler, really helped support and create these modern mining standards. And so these are some of the things to think through. I was also at pains here not to put my own opinion forward, and I think that was key for me as I was writing here, because my opinion sort of matters less than the actual reader, for her or himself, to grapple with these issues. I present a lot of perspectives from a lot of different folks on all sides of these issues, and sort of bring it to them, because I really think that the book hopefully will spark a conversation nationally and internationally about the choices that we need to be making here. You know, I mean, as we were saying earlier, oil and gas obviously has its detractors and its supporters across the globe, but I think there is a broad agreement that we need to have more of these critical minerals to have not only the energy transition, but the electronics that build our lives. Now, the main choice is kind of where and how and why do we get them?
It sounds almost, this makes the book so interesting. It's if I'm not mistaken, at least by some evidence, the mining of copper is older than agriculture, or about the same. So this is really one of the oldest things that humanity is doing. And here we are, kind of right back to this very question. But what do you think is going to be the role of government in this? Like, if we look, you just mentioned China, right? The Chinese government played a significant role in cornering the market, especially for the refining of minerals. So in the case of the US, do you think it would be, and I think you mentioned this a little bit, do you think there should be something like, we had a CHIPS Act now, we had the Inflation Reduction Act, do you think there should be something like a national I just spitballing here, like a National Minings Act or something in that regard? Or would you say, you know what, there has been mining done in the United States, it has been done, we have mines that are over 100 years old, should this be done, on a state level by private actors, or should there be a concerted effort by the federal government?
Sure. I mean, there definitely are various laws across U.S. states, but Ralph, there actually has been a mining law on the books in the United States since 1872. You heard that right, 1872. That's more than 150 years ago, which is sort of mind-boggling. And it's been updated slightly, but pretty much it's the same that it's been back in 1872. And so this is desperately needed to be updated. I do argue in the book, and more people need to know about it. I mean, this law was originally written to encourage development of the Western United States back when there was not that much in terms of habitation going on there. Obviously, we know the Western United States is packed with a lot of people now. Just look at Las Vegas with last night's Super Bowl. The law makes mining one of the most lucrative parts of the electric vehicle supply chain. I mean, think about this. I mean, you can get almost double-digit margins if you mine for critical minerals used to make an electric vehicle. But to actually make that electric vehicle, the margins are about 1 or 2%. And I unpack this in the book. I mean, that's just mind-boggling. And part of the reason that is because if you take metals out of the ground in the Western United States on federal land, and a lot of the deposits in the Western US are on federal land, you don't pay royalties. Now, that's virtually unheard of in the Western world right now, or most of the world right now, that is. I mean, if you take copper out of the ground in Chile, you're paying the Chilean government a royalty, for instance. And so this has made mining extremely lucrative for the companies that are out there. And a lot of detractors would say this needs to be updated in order to have more money go into coffers, federal coffers. I mean, the land is owned by me and you and Tracy and everyone else because we're all taxpayers here in the United States. And so, I mean, these are the types of things that some conservationists and others are increasingly saying need to be paid attention to if we're going to update this mining law that's been around since 1872.
There's actually great profit. So if you have a mine that has been running for a couple of decades, it's great. But you tell also the story, I think, in Nevada about there's some very rare flower blooming there, and that has kind of been holding up the development of their lithium deposits. Can I tell the story real quick in a few sentences? Yeah,
this forms the spine of the narrative, and it was so fascinating to me as a writer and an author to explore. There's a proposed lithium mine about 200 miles north of Las Vegas, massive lithium deposit, but the land that contains this lithium also contains the home of a rare flower found nowhere else on the planet. And so the tension right from the beginning of the book is what matters more, the lithium or this flower, and can the lithium be developed without disturbing this flower? I mean, this flower is found nowhere else on the planet, so it sparks a huge defense from a conservation group that goes toe-to-toe with this lithium mining company that wants to develop it. And you follow through the arc of the book the story of this, interspersed with projects across the country and across the world here. And both people on both sides here are very earnest with their perspectives on the project, including the head of the lithium company who used to be in the oil and gas space and sees lithium as his way of really leaving the planet cleaner for his children and grandchildren than the one that he found. But bringing to the reader this idea of choice, like, should we let the lithium be extracted if that could potentially harm the flower? Would it harm the flower? And if we didn't do anything, wouldn't the flower go extinct because of climate change? So these are the tough things that the book really brings to the reader.
And I think that's very important because you do bring up a lot of these socioeconomic factors, but then, what kind of decisions do we have to make? And this is not new to the mining industry. I mean, the oil and gas industry has faced this for decades.
Yeah.
Which I find very fascinating because ultimately we have to make these own choices, our own choices on, how we're going to address these issues. But you also talk about collaboration and conflict are common themes within the mining industry. So can you kind of share some examples of cooperation? Why can't I speak today? Cooperation or competitions on miners or mining companies that you've encountered while researching your book?
Yeah, I mean, a great example, and Ralph alluded to this a little bit earlier, is the largest mine in North America of any metal is the Morencis mine in Arizona, which is owned by a company called Freeport-McMoRan, and itself is one of the world's largest copper miners. It's got operations all across the globe. And I got to visit Morenci as part of the reporting for this book and take a tour of it. This is a massive site. It's got multiple open pits. It's got giant trucks the size of houses moving in and out of different pits each day, just moving tons and tons and tons of rock and producing just gargantuan amounts of copper. The mine, as you would imagine, being in Arizona, needs a lot of water, and the state itself has been in a drought for a long time. So they actually buy a lot of the water that they do need from the nearby San Carlos Apache people who live on their reservation and have water rights there. And that's part of a collaboration that the company itself has really tried to nurture for the past 20, 30, 40 years. And so there's a great example of cooperation and collaboration between an indigenous group and a large company. What I also explore in the book is how the same tribe is fighting a proposed copper mine from a different copper company known as Rio Tinto, about an hour east of Arizona. And this would be an underground copper mine that would be one of the largest suppliers of copper to the United States. It would supply about 25% of the US copper needs. So as you can imagine, huge potential there, especially as this energy transition accelerates. But the problem with this deposit is that if it were developed, the underground deposit would crater over a number of years and basically destroy a site that many San Carlos Apache consider of high religious significance. And so therein lies the tension with the company. And so the Rio Tinto company and the San Carlos Apache are obviously at odds here, and there's huge competition about who should actually win out here in this. And it's currently going through, various rounds of litigation, and we are in an election year. So we'll see what happens with President Biden and who wins in November. But that sort of juxtaposition between the alliance between one mining company and the San Carlos Apache people, meanwhile, the competition between that same tribe and another mining company, I think was important to unpack here because too often I think people look at a lot of these issues as intractable, as just one side versus the other. But really, indeed, there's multifaceted sides to all of these things. People on all different sides and can take different approaches depending on the scenarios. And the tribal chairman for the San Carlos Apache people told me for the book, his approach to selling this water, it's all about tribal self-determination. And that's part of the narrative here as well that I really tried to show with respect and with nuance, because, it's for the reader to decide for her and himself kind of what's important here. And that's what I was at pains to present.
Ralph, you're up.
Yeah, I was just because I at some point I have to go back to the leaf blower because this has been.
Let's do it.
Because it's really one of the issues that I believe has only been, and of course your book touches on this as well. So I was kind of collecting my thoughts a little bit because this has come up. There's been I think the rare earth war. There's a couple of, and I think yours really stands out both in quality and particularly in the way you tell the story. But the kind of sentiment and the realization of the importance of mining is really growing. Right? I think even people, like Mark Mills and others who have been talking about this for a long time, they get significantly more attention now because this really has drawn and drained more and more attention. Do you think there is a lack in education? I know this sounds like it's off topic, but this is sometimes I'm often wondering because it's true, as you said before, right? With oil and gas, it's clear to have the detractors and the supporters. But in many ways, as you describe it so aptly, is that what makes the modern world run. So wherever somebody stands, one thing is absolutely clear. We want it to be cleaner. We want it to be more efficient. But nobody is really willing to give up the living standards. And that's sometimes I feel a little bit the part that at least the enthusiasts like to cover out is or the idea that you say just leave it in the ground. It's not just stop oil, stop everything, just leave it in the ground. yeah, you can do this, but then it's questionable if our living standards can continue. Do you think that we should look into some ways to kind of educate young people about this? Again, as you said, not indoctrinate them, just as you do in your book, tell them the story. Say it's a trade-off. There is no perfect solution. There is no miracle solution. It's a trade-off. And sometimes it's lithium or rare flour. And these are really tough calls.
Yeah, Tracy might chuckle at this story, but when I covered oil and gas, and when I lived in North Dakota, I would go back to New York sometimes, and invariably people's initial guttural reaction was, okay, fracking, good or bad? And then invariably they would have like arrived in a taxi powered by gasoline, or they'd be drinking out of like a red Solo Cup made from a petroleum product. And so I would say, it's not up to me. It's what about you? I mean, you can say fracking good or bad, but here are the, two things, and just in the past 20 minutes that you used in your life touched by petroleum products. And so I started to see a lot of those same issues carry over into the critical minerals space when I started covering this and when I started reporting and writing the book. And I think you're right, Ralph. The more we talk about the tough choices that we all face here, the more we educate people around the complexities of these global supply chains and how every decision that they make has an impact on the broader supply chains. I think the better. And what I wanted to do here with this book is really tell about the people on all sides here, and not write a book for geologists or for investors, but really a book for everyday people, because it's about a topic that affects us all. And so while there are some heavy numbers in the book, there's mostly a huge focus on people here, and that was the best way that I knew as the writer and as the author to help basically spread the message here that these are complex issues that we've got to be thinking through, and really help people to understand it. And in a certain way, there is more complexity than the oil and gas space, because think about oil and gas. I think generally people understand that you take oil out of the ground and you put it into a refinery, and out you get maybe jet fuel or gasoline or diesel, et cetera, et cetera. They might not necessarily understand all the mechanisms, but sort of that broad flow. I mean, with critical minerals, the way that you process lithium, for instance, is vastly different than the way you process copper, and certainly with rare earths, wildly different as well there. And so those are just three of the many critical minerals and metals out there. And so you start to see a splintering of the knowledge base around these supply chains. And so it's going to have to take an even more informed consumer to understand that the supply chains for these things are just growing and getting vastly more complex. And so the issues are more complex. So we have to be thinking through them more than perhaps we even did with the oil and gas industry. I mean, we didn't have this collective reckoning 150 years ago when a petroleum-based economy was coming up. And what did we get out of that? We got a lot of conflicts in the 20th century over oil. We got climate change. We got a large cartel that controls a huge amount of the world's oil production. And if we don't have these same discussions now, if we don't have a collective reckoning, if you will, then we're going to have perhaps maybe some of the same mistakes. I mean, I explore this in the book, but several analysts have warned that there could be conflicts in the 21st century over copper, which kind of sounds mind-boggling when you think about it. But if there's not enough copper out there to power all these devices, then there could be conflicts over where we get these supplies. And so I really, to your point, Ralph, I really hope that the book serves as an education point or a touchstone for these broader conversations, because there are people that are living on the front lines of these decisions every single day. And the choices we make or the choices we refuse to make are going to have a huge impact on the global economy, because whoever really controls these critical minerals will control the 21st century global economy.
This has been something that always I find so, and you mentioned so nice in the book, so mind-boggling. I think there is still this perception, and full disclosure here, I had a similar perception until a couple of years ago, that whether it's crude oil, whether it's natural gas, whether it's coal, whether it's lithium, you dig a hole, you pull it out of the ground, and then you put it in your car, or wherever, or you put it in your cell phone. But as you describe, you get it out, then you have to refine it. I think you mentioned also in your book that technically lithium is not really counted as a mineral, but more as a chemical compound in a way, because the process is so complicated. So there's so many steps involved. There's so much technology involved. But isn't it also, and I don't mean to shift gears here, because this is something Tracy has been talking about quite a bit in recent months. Even in the oil and gas sector, the refinery infrastructure in the United States and elsewhere in the West is fairly old. So kind of the new building of generally the idea, let's put it on the broadest, but the idea of resource refining doesn't seem to have many fans in the Western world at the moment.
I think that's broadly true. You know, one of the last stories I wrote when I covered oil and gas was Chevron's move to invest a lot of money in its Bay Area oil refinery. And it seemed very counterintuitive, but as a lot of other refineries shut down in California, it was basically a bet on being the last person standing. So very shrewd bet there. But you're right. I mean, there is not as much refining capacity now in the United States as there could or should be. You know, I live in the Houston area. We're obviously surrounded by a lot of oil refineries, but you know, elsewhere in the country, there's not that many. And then I think when you extrapolate that to copper, for instance, there's only, I want to say, 3 copper smelters in the United States. So all these projects that I write about in the book that people are fighting over, I mean, we can have the tussle around whether or not we should build them. But then the next question to your point, Ralph, is, okay, well, what do you actually do with the copper? Because if you want it to stay in the United States or North America and help the regional economy, you got to turn it into a product you can actually use. You know, I mean, you can take the rock out of the ground, but then all you have is a pile of rocks. So you have to, you know, have a process to turn it into wires or pipes, et cetera, et cetera. And so these are the other tough choices that we need to be making here as well. I mean, nobody wants a mine in their backyard. I mean, a smelter, as much as they've advanced technologically speaking in recent years, I mean, it's still a giant industrial facility that not a lot of people would necessarily want. But yet, we all use them. I mean, we couldn't be talking right now without copper wiring. I mean, that's how we're talking to each other. And so this is just sort of, you know, one other example of the things that we really, really, really have to be thinking through.
Well, again, it's I don't want this in my backyard kind of.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think another complexity, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ernest, is that, you know, it's not, the technology is moving so fast as for, like, even if we take lithium, for example, and what kind of batteries we're producing, you know, that solid state. So now you're talking not only processing lithium one way, now you're talking processing lithium another way. So that, you know, so can you talk a little bit about how this technology is, you know, particularly, you know, with the oil and gas, the refining process hasn't really changed much, right? But if we look at, you know, lithium, what kind of, you know, here we got this rock, now we got to, you know, do we, you know, we're going to try to build all these sorts of different type of batteries, right? Which requires a slightly different ion, a slightly different configuration of the processing. And so can you maybe talk a little bit about maybe the complexity of this and what the complexity that it adds to the industry?
Yeah, and this builds off of a point that Ralph made a few minutes ago, is that a lot of lithium companies would say that they don't actually make a mine product, they make a specialty chemical product. And, you know, I mean, we could sort of talk all day about the parlance and whether or not those are the words you should use, but at the end of the day, it is a mine product taken out of the ground, and how you specialize that for use in a battery depends on what your end customer wants. And so it's hard to say sort of where technology will go in 5, 10, 15, 20 years. I know there's a lot of talk about sodium ion batteries and others potentially eating lithium's lunch. But when we just look at, I like to take a step back and sort of just look at the adoption growth curve for lithium ion batteries. We sort of might have a remembrance of the early 90s. We had a family member that might show up to a birthday party with this giant thing called a Sony camcorder. And you're just like, oh, this is fascinating. You know, it can actually record what's going on and not connected to wires and yada, yada. And it's got a battery in it that can be recharged. And so it was a very novel concept. And so obviously we've had a huge proliferation of lithium ion batteries since then, and they become extremely popular, partly because they're rechargeable and partly because they're so light, thanks to lithium. I think that adoption took, it seems kind of fast, but, you know, 20, 30 years is you know, it took a long adoption time there. And so the idea of something else coming, another type of chemistry sort of eating lithium's lunch, it doesn't sort of bear out in sort of mass adoption points right now. I mean, what we do know is that there's a lot of research going into solid state, like you were mentioning, Tracy, and solid state is a next generation type of battery, but that requires even more lithium than lithium ion batteries. That's what we do know. And companies like Albemarle, the world's largest lithium company, they've got armies of scientists that are looking at, okay, how do we push even more lithium into a battery, regardless of the type, regardless of whether it's a solid state or lithium ion battery. And so there's a huge army of research going in to these areas right now. And I think the lithium industry will be able to certainly pivot to wherever it goes in the future. One of the chapters that I look at in The War Below is recycling. And I think it's a key part of the conversation here because oil and gas is burned off, of course, in combustion. But a lot of these metals can be repurposed and reused. You know, lithium doesn't use its ability to hold a charge just because it's been in a battery for 10 years. But the recycling industry has a lot of logistical problems right now. I mean, just imagine shipping a whole rare car full of old batteries. They obviously have a charge and they obviously can explode because they're old and they might be damaged, and you put like 500 of them in a giant bin in a rail car and they could explode. And so that's why transportation is the biggest cost and biggest hurdle in the recycling infrastructure right now. But if we can actually make recycling more widespread, and we can get more black mass. Black mass is like shredded battery parts. And if we can sort of get it to even more facilities that can actually then take out the lithium and the other metals inside, then you could start to see that we could really have a broader use of these metals out there, regardless of where chemistries go in the future. And that could really help the broader electronics manufacturing industry grow. And so I look at in the book, I profile J.B. Straubel's Redwood, as well as Ajay Kachar's life cycle, and the history behind those two companies and their different approaches to recycling. And interestingly, to your point around battery design, Tracy, they're thinking through, okay, how do we look at recycling a battery that comes into us 10 years down the road if the chemistries are changing? So these are part of the complexities that they're thinking through now. And an analog that some like to use is the lead acid battery industry. So lead acid batteries power internal combustion engine vehicles. And if you own one, you know that if it dies, you turn it in and you buy a new one. And what you might not notice is there's a few bucks tacked on to the purchase price of the new one. And what it does is it powers this and finances this whole ecosystem that's behind the scenes that we never see, where all these lead acid batteries are broken apart and then reused and built into new lead acid batteries. And it's just become so second nature for this entire industry to grow. And so I explore this a little bit in the book, sort of the idea, like, could that same infrastructure or same channel be created for lithium ion batteries there? And yes, there are different chemistries out there, and yes, there could be different technological advances, but these are things I think we've got to be thinking through here. Make it second nature when your electric vehicle's battery is at end of life to turn it in, and part of the purchase price for a new one could include help funding this recycling system. So I think we're at the very beginning stages of figuring that out right now.
And of course, a lot of what you're dealing with is the matter of the demand for things that are already there. But of course, what's very often forgotten, and I'm not accusing you of this because you definitely don't do this, but very often in the public debate what is forgotten, there's a huge chunk of the world that barely has any access to electronic devices or to electricity per se. So it's, even if we would say, well, you know, as I said at the beginning, if not the transition is not unfolding as one would anticipate, if we assume that people everywhere at any time want to improve their living standards, this of course will include people wanting, for good reasons, right, wanting to have electronic devices, wanting to have all these tools and gadgets that allow us the kind of life that we live. So even I think in the most, whether we want to call it a pessimistic or optimistic scenario, there is no, it's actually, I want to formulate it as a question. There is no way that goes beyond or that can avoid increased demand for these resources, right? No matter how we try to slice the cake, the demand for this will go up no matter what.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, just we look at any number, the IEA, the EIA, like any sort of think tank you look at across the world, whether in the energy spectrum or in the general interest spectrum, you know, has just projected a huge demand jump in all of these things. I was intrigued as part of the book to look at the other side of that coin, though. You know, we all have heard sort of the argument that we need to basically deindustrialize from some corners, and I think sometimes those are considered fringe groups. But there was one deindustrialized group that was fighting a proposed lithium project in northern Nevada on the Oregon border, and this would be the largest lithium mine in the entire North American continent, one of the largest in the world. And the folks fighting this mine were sort of small, but very vocal. And I started to see some echoes of the beginning of the protest against the Dakota Access Pipeline in North Dakota, which I covered as part of my work here at Reuters. And so that started as a very small group that mushroomed to about 5,000 people into this huge protest camp. So I started to wonder, okay, could this grow into something as big here? It did not get that big, but this group of the industrialists were able to use their cause and really amplify it mightily. They ended up on the front page of the New York Times. Bill McKibben wrote about them in the New Yorker and said it was a fascinating debate that they were sparking. And so as for the book, for The War Below, I actually went to the protest camp and hiked around the site with one of these individuals and actually spent the night camping out there. And it was interesting to tell his story because he advocates for a complete end to all the electronics that we use in our everyday lives, a return to an agrarian way of life, and basically no electric vehicles, no electronics out there. And this is sort of all part of his belief that this is the best way to address climate change, that in his words, sort of just changing what's under the hood of a car is not the way to prevent the planet from cooking itself to death. And I thought that was an interesting perspective to include in the book because he has marshaled so much power behind him for this cause, as well as the attention that it's been received. And so while I'm not, and I want the readers to actually think through this as well. Okay, well, if we're not willing to have a discussion about where we want to mine, are we willing to just forego many of these conveniences, either directly or indirectly? And if we did nothing, would we just forego them anyhow? Because other countries might be willing to use their control of these critical minerals as economic weapons. So that was an important part of the narrative that I thought was important to include, to bring to the reader, this idea that should we just consider turning off all the lights and growing our own food in the backyard, and sort of that's the best way to fight climate change. Many might say sort of right off the bat, no, that's crazy. But this person has been able to marshal a lot of support for his cause, and a lot of people have globbed onto it more than you would think.
I mean, actually, the degrowth movement is very popular in Europe as well. So it's not something that is just kind of fringe. I mean, it is, but there's Lancaster, Pennsylvania that you can move to as well if you want. But
Right. Well, yeah, you're right. I mean, that's a group of people that have eschewed technology for hundreds of years, right, and have done so quite successfully. So that's part of it out there. This was a story that I thought was important to include. Like I was saying at the top, I mean, I would say 98% of people that I talked to for the book, everyone said we need more, but sort of that 2% that said we don't need more, I thought was important for the narrative.
All right, I want to switch this on. I didn't mean to put you on the spot. I'm going to switch this on the role of technology in modern mining, because you discussed this as well. And so what technological advancements did you find most intriguing or impactful in your research?
I found two things. I mean, automation and AI. So you think, let's take the second one first. I mean, mining equipment just throws out tons and tons of reams of data every single day. Everything from how far they drill, to the type of rock, to water, to porosity, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a lot of attempts right now to harness a lot of that data to be smarter about drilling and digging into mines, whether that's above ground or below ground. And that's also helping on things like mapping out where in a deposit to go. So if you feel like the grade, or which is the percentage of a metal in a rock, is increasing, the computer can calculate all of that. The AI, I should say, can in theory, this is all very sort of nascent right now, could sort of calculate that you should be digging here and not maybe here. And you might have more success by digging there. So that helps decrease emissions, that helps in a whole range. It helps save time, it helps save money. And so there's a lot of research being put into that. Automation, especially, I find really interesting. I mean, we've all heard about Waymo, the troubles that they've been having, and other self-driving car companies. The beauty of a mine site typically is that it's closed. And so if you have equipment, regardless of how big it is, it probably is going the same route back and forth every single day. And you don't have a lot of people walking around there that could potentially be hit by this. And so we have a lot of automation transportation companies that are actually testing most of their technology at mining sites right now. The site that we were talking about earlier that involves the rare flour, the company that wants to develop that site has signed an agreement with Caterpillar to be the first new mine in North America that uses autonomous vehicles. which is fascinating to think about. A mine built from scratch that's ideated around autonomous vehicles. So what would that look like? What would the mine of the future look like, where you don't have people driving trucks, but you have computers driving trucks? So I found that really, really interesting to explore here. And how would that look? I mean, you would need presumably fewer people or fewer people on site. The way you would design a truck would be extremely different. So there's all these sort of changes in how you think about it. But the mining industry has been changing significantly the past 100 years. I mean, it was only in the 1960s, 1970s that a lot of mines used trains. They would install train tracks around these big circular pits. Obviously, that was a very cost-intensive and time-intensive process. And so just bringing trucks then radically changed it. So now if you bring automated trucks, how much further will that change it? So I'm fascinated by technology just sort of broadly, and I'm sort of intrigued where this space goes in the next 5, 10, 20 years.
Have you when you visited mines, do you have a sense also that, because I was at COP28 and I had a conversation there with somebody who said, we will electrify mines, no problem, easy peasy, can be done. I talked to other members of the industry who said, that's complete pie in the sky nonsense. Right? You cannot run mining trucks on batteries. Me, as a political scientist, I have no clue about any of these things. I have my inclinations, but of course I can, as much as I enjoy giving into my biases, I cannot do it all the time. So going along on the technology side, what's your take on this? Do you think that even the energy used in mining can be quote unquote cleaner, or will there always be some part of the economy that's going to run on fossil fuels and diesel?
I mean, I think it's going to be subjective, right? It's going to depend on where the mine is, what the infrastructure is around it. Some mines are in the middle of nowhere, and it's really hard to get, a huge power line to them. So if you electrify the entire mine, you can think of the base load requirements, the increase in base load requirements for power generation. Some mines are powered by diesel generators just because they're in the middle of nowhere. Increasingly, there are attempts to use more solar power and other wind turbines at some of these mine sites. But it's just, Ralph, it's just a question of logistics. Right? If you can connect to an existing grid infrastructure, you probably would have a much better opportunity to go fully electric than if you were in the middle of nowhere. What I would say, though, broadly, is the industry is slowly inching to this a reality that it needs to, if it's going to supply the building blocks for the energy transition, it should use more renewable power in its operations. And so there broadly is an acknowledgement that needs to happen. And some mines lend themselves to it than others. Underground mines, for instance, do tend to be near large near power projects, because you just have a sure need for a lot more logistical hubs there. And it's a lot of underground mines, like in Chile, for instance, are near smelters. And so smelters need a lot of power. So if you already have a giant power source there, it makes it a little easier to then have an electrified network there. But it's more of a subjective thing, I think. But the industry is moving in that direction.
So not all mines are the same. I think that's another important takeaway from your book.
Completely.
Yeah,
every single mine is different. An underground mine vastly different from an open pit mine. And then the ways you produce lithium right now can either be open pit mines or can involve large evaporation ponds where you use the power of the sun to basically evaporate out various salts. Lithium is a salt. And there's just tons of different ways to produce a lot of these critical minerals, and the way that we mine is different for all of them, and depending on the part of the world. And the ESG concerns can be different as well, depending on the part of the world. If you live next to an indigenous site or you live next to a large population center, obviously your concern is going to be a lot more different than if you are in northern Canada, not surrounded by many people. And so each are a little bit different. And I explore in the book, I think I mentioned earlier, this mining schema that Tiffany helped create, Tiffany and Company. And this took more than a decade for these certification schemas to actually say, okay, what is the ideal mine and what is the best way to mine? And part of the reason was that you had all these people in a room arguing about, okay, what if you have a mine near the equator versus something in the Arctic versus something in the Southwest United States, et cetera, et cetera. And so you got to see a lot of these issues sort of tossed around and debated to decide what is the best way to mine here.
And we're coming up on the hour, so I don't want to take too much of your time. I do appreciate this. So Ralph, if you don't have any other questions, I kind of want to wrap this up with a couple other questions. Okay, go.
Of one final question.
Sure.
And this, Ernest, is a very personal one. You don't have to answer it. So I'm just projecting from my own personal experience on you. Kind of the more I engage with the energy sector, I cannot say this, but this is full disclosure. I really started to kind of fall in love with it. Like, I don't care if it's oil or gas or coal or nuclear or wind. I found it an incredibly fascinating field, and it gives me tremendous joy. So I have to ask you, did you fall in love with mining while you were working on your book, or is it a love-hate relationship, or is it purely platonic?
Well, I mean, what I will say is that I've been very thankful for everyone that talked to me for this book and just gave up their time and their expertise on all sides here. I mean, these are extremely complex areas, but at its core, if you'll forgive the pun, it involves people, and it's a human story. And like I said, it's a story about choice. And so I've been just fortunate to be able to tell these stories. And I think mining right now lives at the center of our global economy in a way that it didn't even 20 years ago. And so to be able to tell these stories, to tell the human stories here that are the center of this debate about choice, was a privilege for me. And I'm just thankful for folks that trusted me with their stories for The War Below.
So, as an author, what do you want readers to ultimately take away from this book, and what message or insight do you most want to impart through this book?
Yeah, I mean, Tracy, this is my first book, and I've learned a lot during the writing process here. I remember Dan Jurgen, when I started this, told me, he goes, how do you write a book one sentence at a time? And boy, was he right. The one thing that I've learned through the process is you get to ask your audience one question. And the question really that I'm bringing to the audience here is this idea of choice. I mean, what are the choices that we're willing to make? And so if people come away with only one thing from the book, I really hope it's this realization that we've got to be grappling with where we want to get the building blocks for our everyday lives. I mean, it's not just about the energy transition. It's about all these other gadgets and gizmos that we use every single day. And if we're not willing to have that discussion, then we have to admit that we need to be comfortable with these building blocks coming from places in the world that might not share our ESG standards, or might be willing to use them as economic weapons, as China has indicated time and time again that it is willing to use its control of the critical minerals sector as an economic weapon. And so there's a lot of choices here, and we can't put our heads in the sand anymore. And I wrote the book especially for folks in the United States because I wanted Americans to really grapple with these choices. And I hope the book sparks a broader conversation about all of these debates that we need to be having here. And I wrote it for everyone because this really is a topic that affects everyone.
Absolutely. The War Below by Ernest Scheyder. Thank you so much for being our guest today, and we look forward to having you back again.
Anytime. It's great to be with you, Tracy and Ralph.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it.